Okay, so pleasant good morning, everyone. So today we'll be looking at tissues. Previously, we looked at the whole setup of the human. We noted the particular arrangement from chemicals. Chemicals, make up the cells, are found and incorporated into the different structures of the cells. Cells to tissues, tissues to organs, organs to organ systems. So today we'll be looking at the next logical part, since we already looked at cells last day. So we're moving on now to tissues of the human body. So just in terms of a overview, what we'll be looking at, these four tissues specifically: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous tissues. These parts here we would not be including on today's lecture. So in terms, just to refresh our memories, when we are thinking or examining the human body, there's a very logical arrangement with it. We see that atoms, the smallest parts, right? Atoms are arranged to form molecules. These molecules are found and utilized by the cell itself in certain organelles, such as the mitochondria, as shown here. The organelles are incorporated into cells. And it's very interesting to note as well, these molecules, they are part of structural components of the cell, namely proteins, carbohydrates, and fats. The cells themselves, associated ones, they form tissues. And this is where our focus will be on today. We'll be looking at tissues. Now, multicellular organisms, they require specialized cells to perform numerous tasks. These cells then organize into tissues, organs, and organ systems. All right, and just as a means of refresher, could you all remind me, how many organ systems do we have?
11.
11. Which one is the most important? They're all important. Which one? Reproductive. Why would you say reproductive?
Because if we don't reproduce,
excellent. Yeah. If we don't reproduce, we'll die, we'll disappear as a species. So what is a tissue? In terms of from a definition point of view, a tissue is a group of cells that work together to accomplish a common function. So there are four primary tissue types, namely epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous, ECMN. Could anybody think of a way how we could remember that? Those four tissue types with those letters, ECMN. Could you think of a word or something we could, MECN, you could think of a word? MENC, that's probably the best one, MENC, all right? But whichever way, pardon? Go ahead, yeah?
Say what you were saying in my mind.
Oh, MENC, right. Or two, yeah. So whichever way, just remember those four. There are four major ones. And let's talk about them. Epithelial, they cover the body surfaces. They line cavities and organs and form glands. All right, so epithelial, they're usually associated in a more, well, you could say a protective function. Connective tissue, they bind and support the body, provides protection for organs. They serve as a storage site for fat, and they participate in immunity. All right, so take note of all of these things that connective tissues does. They don't only connect things as we might think just from the name itself, but they bind and support the body, provide protection, serve as a storage site for fat, and they also, most critically, they also participate in immunity. Muscle tissue, this is responsible for movement, right? And of course, nervous tissue. Nervous tissue, these receive stimuli, and what else do they do? Conduct nerve impulses. Nervous tissue, that's the next topic we'll be looking at. Once we finish with tissues, we will be looking at nervous tissues and the important role that they play in terms of generation of action potentials, and not only generating them, but carrying them throughout the body. Fascinating, okay? Now, epithelial tissue, they cover let's talk about them in a little more detail. We look at the four. What are the four types? I forget. What are the four types of tissues? Or is it mense, or somebody put in semen? Of course, you have to remember the spelling. It's just a capital C-M-E-N, not the regular spelling of it. So what does the C stand for? If you're looking at semen, what does the C stand for? Connective tissue. Connective. What does the M stand for? Muscle tissue. What does the E stand for?
Epithelial.
Epithelial. And the N stands for? Nervous tissue. Excellent. Well done. Excellent. So it's connective, muscle, epithelial, and nervous. Let's talk about epithelial. So the epithelial, they cover the surfaces. That's what they do. And they line cavities. So you can think about epithelial like paint. You know, you have paint in your house, and what Christmas time coming, so what you have to do? Well, you have to go inside, you have to paint inside your room. You have to go, well, if you, so these are outside as well, you know, it's flaking a little bit, so you have to paint on the outside. So epithelial, they cover things. So one of the ways you can remember epithelial, think about paint. You know, that's what they do, they cover things. So, you know, just like how paint covers your house, epithelial tissues do the same thing. They serve for protection, secretion, and absorption, and they may contain glands as well. And epithelial tissues, they are tightly packed together. Now, why do you think, could you see a correlation between the fact that they are packed tightly together and protection? What would happen if they were loosely packed? Would they be able to give a lot of protection?
No, things would be able to penetrate.
No, things would be able to penetrate.
Yeah, I don't know. When y'all were younger, I don't know. Y'all used to play this game, Red Rover, send somebody over or something like that.
Red over.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right? And you know, when somebody, and what you have to do, you have to run and try to burst through, right?
Yeah.
You know, you have your arms linked. Yeah, your arms linked and you're running through. Right. So if you realize, I think one of the techniques, if I remember correctly, that people would do is stand close together. Yeah. So it was very difficult for somebody to find a space, because one thing you realize, if you have a lot of space, it's easy for things to pass through. And this is the same thing with epithelial tissue. They're very closely packed together when you look at it under the microscope. And do remind me at the end of class, we look at some tissues, right, under the microscope itself. And they're very closely packed because they don't allow things to pass between them. Could you think of another type of tissue, however, that is loosely packed, that allows things to pass through them? I might have mentioned it, and I'll give you a hint. It has to do with the lungs and the exchange of gases. It's a particular type of, you could say, blood conduit in the body, and it is one cell thick. But interestingly, they have a lot of spaces between them, which allows for gaseous exchange in the lungs. It begins with C.
Capillaries, sir?
Thank you very much. Yeah. So capillaries, right? Capillaries, they have a lot of spaces between them, which is unlike epithelial, close packed, just like paint in a house. They cover things, right? They line glands, just like how paint lines inside of your room. That's the function of epithelial tissues. Now, all epithelial tissues, they have two characteristics. One, a surface that is specialized for protection, secretion, or absorption. So it's three things that the surfaces of epithelial cells do. They either protect, they secrete, or they absorb. All right, so you can think about it like paint, and then you take a sponge, a wet sponge, and you put, you know, on the surface. So when you squeeze the sponge, if it does have liquid in it, of course, the water will come out. And conversely, if it's on the outside and the sponge is dry, when rain falls, what would it do? It absorbs the water. So in remembering, when you're looking at epithelial tissue, think about paint, think about with a sponge, a wet sponge, and that will clue you in on the functions of what they do. One, protection, and two, just like a sponge, it absorbs and it also secretes. Epithelial tissue, they don't just exist in the body, but instead a basement membrane binds these tissues together, binds these tissues to the underlying connective tissue. So this basement membrane, you can think about it like a glue, right? It sticks it down to the underlying connective tissue. Talked about epithelial tissue, right? What are the three functions. What do epithelial tissues do? They do three particular things. What are they? P, S, and A.
They protect.
They protect. What about the S?
Secrete and absorb.
What you're saying, excellent, thanks very much, right? They secrete as well and they absorb. That is their functionality. Now let's talk about the shape. So we talk about their function, now let's look at their structure, all right? Now there are three basic shapes. You have squamous, cuboidal, and columnar epithelium, right? So it's three, S, C, and C. A cuboidal means it looks very much like a cube. Columnar, it's taller than it is wide, and squamous, it has a irregular shape, as we'll see. Let's have a look. So the simple epithelial, it's a single layer of cells classified according to the type. Stratified is two or more layers. Now, stratified, just by definition, the word refers to layers. Pseudo stratified, it looks like it has more than one, but it really does not. So stratified epithelia, when you're looking at bricks, on a wall, you see how you could tell, you could stop and count the number of layers of brick, 1, 2, 3, 4, because it's regular and it's separated by a bit of cement. That is what stratified epithelial looks like. Now the pseudo-stratified, it looks like it has more than one layer, but it really does not. It has to do with the irregularity of the cell itself. And we'll see some examples in a little bit, which will clarify it. The glandular epithelial, these secrete products like mucus, digestive enzymes, and hormones. So the glandular, that's part of the secretory function of the epithelial tissue. They give off things, and they give off things like mucus. Where in your body would you find mucus being secreted? Where would you find it in your body?
In nose, nasal area.
Your nasal area, very true. Where else? In your lungs, yeah. Because as we're well aware, in particular, and you'd see it professionally, with COVID patients, right, they do bring up mucus. So when you're looking at it, it's really the entire respiratory tract, from your mouth all the way down to your, into the lungs. The stomach, very good, yes, right? And when we look at digestion, you look more at digestion in SNF2, you'd see then that the gastric glands, right, they secrete acid. And of course, which is why it's very important for the stomach to secrete mucus to literally protect itself from being digested. All right, so those are some of the examples of types of epithelial cells and as it relates to their glandular function. Now, simple squamous now. They're one layer of flattened cells, and they usually form the lining of blood vessels and air sacs in the lungs, particularly the alveoli. And their function is to exchange nutrients, waste, gases, and protection. Now, structure and function. When we think about simple squamous, we see that we find them in the lining of the blood vessels and in the lungs. The alveoli, which is the alveoli is really something like a bunch of grapes, and they exist on the smallest part of the lungs beyond the bronchioles. Now, could you see a link between structure and function? So they are flattened, and how does that help? If you're very flat, how does that help in terms of movement of gas across your surface? Does that help? In other words, if you compare two things, one that has a thin wall and a thick wall, which one would the gas move faster across?
In
The
the thin wall.
Yeah, and when you think about that movement, the movement of that gas is by what process? It's moving from an area of high concentration of oxygen, let's say in inspired air that is inside the lung. What you're saying, excellent, diffusion. In general, whenever you hear movement of gases, movement of liquids, and you hear the mention of concentration gradient, where one is at a higher concentration than the other, first thing should jump into mind is diffusion. And yes, diffusion does not only exist with liquids, but it also exists with gases as well. Okay. So simple squamous epithelium. Here it is. They're one layer of flattened cells. So this is what they look like. What does this look like, remind you of, these cells? You all see in the hand on the screen?
Yes,
Right. So what do these cells remind you of?
The ground?
The ground, yeah, it looks like a dry ground, yes. Yes, yes, right? So they're flat, they're flattened, and they're very wide, but if you're looking at their diameter, they're very narrow, and that is to allow the gas to move rapidly across them, across the surface, all right? So you would find them in your air sacs, and it allows the exchange of both nutrients, gases, and waste. So simple squamous, big thing to remember is that not only are they large, but they're flat. They're very flat, like a biscuit. Now let's talk about stratified. Stratified means layering. So stratified squamous, these are several layers of flattened cells, and they are located on the surface of the skin and lining of the mouth, esophagus, and vagina. So this is where you would find stratified squamous. And why is the vaginal lining? Why it is you would find these cells there? Well, they provide protection against abrasion, infection, and drying out, most critically. So of course, during the reproductive process, when you do have the entry of the penis into the vaginal area, it would be a little bit uncomfortable for both persons if it was indeed dry. So a bit of lubrication is actually provided by the action of these cells there. And not only that, so in so doing, they protect against abrasion and also infection. So the mucus itself could trap bacteria and prevent their forward motion. So that is one of the important things as well. And another thing which you would learn when we look at the reproductive process, that'll be in SNF2, is that the high pH of the vaginal area as well is also presents a barrier to infection. So this is stratified squamous. This is what it looks like. So stratified means layering. So if you look here, you see they're in different layers. You have several layers of these cells, and they're stacked upon one another. And where would you find stratified squamous? Well, as shown here, you would find it on the surface of the skin and the lining of the mouth in particular, esophagus, and vagina. It provides protection against abrasion, infection, and drying out. So take note, stratified squamous is nothing more than the flattened cells, the squamous cells, but now they are packed on top of one another, right? Like layers. As I see this, what does this remind you of?
A sponge?
A sponge, yeah, very good, yeah. So a cross section of a sponge, it does look very much like that, okay? So simple cuboidal now. So we look at squamous, they're flat, stratified squamous. Now we're looking at cuboidal. So a cube, right? If you could recall from math, a cube is nothing more than a square in 3 dimensions, has the same dimensions up, down, and across. So simple cuboidals, they're one layer of cube-shaped cells. And where do you find cuboidal? You find them in the kidneys, ovaries, and glands. And their function as well, like a sponge, is to secrete and to absorb. So a nice parallel with simple cuboidal, think about a sponge. A sponge which is kind of, well, it's not cuboidal, but you know, it has a regular shape when you purchase them from the store, that is. And that's what it do. You could link that shape to what they do. Sponge, you squeeze it, it's secreting. If you put it down in water, it absorbs. So simple cuboidal, what they do is they both secrete and absorb. And where do you find them? These one-layer cells, they're located in the lining of the kidney tubules and the glands themselves, right? So of course, that is where they're secretory, very important in terms of when you look at glands in particular for secreting things. They function, as we mentioned, in both absorption and secretion. So here you're looking at the kidneys and they're showing you some simple cuboidal cells. They have a regular shape. So it looks, if you look, this is in section, but if you notice, it has a straight line coming down, whereas when you're looking at the squamous, it had a bit of a flattened irregular shape, but these, they have square, it looks almost like a square in section. Here, if you look at the diagrammatic representation, you could see the regular shape being shown. So simple just mean one layer. Stratified now, it means more than one layer. Just like how we looked at stratified squamous, we had simple cells and then you had stratified. So stratified just means layering. So the stratified cuboidal, these are one layer of cube cells, is more than one, and they're located in the ducts of mammary glands, sweat glands, and salivary glands. And what do the stratified cuboidal do? They protect. Nice way to remember it. Stratified cuboidal is just like a wall because, you know, bricks have a regular shape. So stratified cuboidal, their function is one of protection. So this is just an example here showing stratified cuboidal. And here it is lining. Where we're looking at is lining in terms of its presence, and in doing so, it provides protection. It protects the structures which are located behind it. So these are, it's layered. Notice it is a layer of epithelium. It is a cuboidal layer, but you have more than one layer. So that's how you know it's stratified. So here's the diagrammatic representation. You have one layer. Once you have more than one, it is no longer just cuboidal, but it is stratified cuboidal. Now we move to columnar. Now you have, similarly, you have the simple columnar, and then you have the stratified. Let's talk about the simple first. Now the columnar, they are so-called columnar because they look more like rectangles. So they're taller. They're taller. The height is greater than the width. And you'd find the simple columnar, they line the digestive, respiratory tract, and the uterus. And their function is one of absorption and secretion. So here we are seeing them. Note, simple columnar, they're tall like a column. So hence the name, one layer. How do we know it's one layer? Looking at all of these cells, or even here, how could we tell that is one layer of cells? There's one structure present in the cells that will let you know is only one cell present. What is it? What structure is that?
So I see something like some granules inside there.
Only went real far. Very good, right? I was just thinking about nucleus, but you all went deep in terms of nucleolus and granules and so on. But with few exceptions, cells generally have, is there any cell that have multinucleated? There probably are. One nucleus per cell. So if you notice here, you're seeing a whole lot of nuclei lined up. So, and each one is associated with one cell. Diagrammatically, you could see it a little clearer. One nucleus per cell. So that's how you know that it is one layer. It's not multi-layered. But notice with the columnar, these are tall cells. They're very tall. And you find them in the lining of the gut and the respiratory tract. They function in absorption and secretion. When you think about the gut, yes, you have to absorb nutrients. And the respiratory tract, as we mentioned, you have to secrete mucus. Very important in terms of protection. Now we find this one, the pseudo stratified. So we looked at columnar cells. Cool. Now you have one pseudo stratified. You could call them false ciliated cells. They want to look like a columnar cells, but they're a little different. Let's see why. So it looks like it's one layer, and that it has more than one layer, but it really doesn't. And you would find these pseudo stratified lining the respiratory tract, and their function is to remove debris from the lungs. Anybody ever had something that, as they say, went down the wrong throat?
Yes, sir.
Yes,
When
sir.
you drink water, it actually go down your lungs.
Right, or it gone down. And what happens? What is immediately triggered? There's a reflex action that occurs.
You begin to cough, sir.
Cough reflex, right? So immediately, and the coughing will then, you have, of course, now a very quick contraction of the diaphragm, intercostals, and associated muscles, and that pushes in on the lungs, forcing the air out, and also whatever is in there that went in, be it water or a bit of food or what have you not, it, due to that rapid contraction of those muscles, it forces them out. But sometimes, little bits will be left, and that's where this mucus comes in. So the pseudo-stratified, what they will do, they do secrete the mucus, and they have these ciliated or little finger-like projections to the top of the cells, and they move things on through the rhythmic action, interaction of these little projections on the cell themselves. Any mucus, any objects that are trapped in the mucus, it gets moved along. So their function, remove debris from the lungs. So do remember that pseudo-stratified, very special ones. Anytime you think about pseudo-stratified, you should think about the lungs. How could we draw that connection? Anybody could see how we'll be able to remember those two? You know, when you hear pseudo stratified, you think about lungs. Anybody? Yeah, but any ideas on that?
Coffin, sir.
Coffin, okay. So pseudo stratified ciliated. Yeah, you just link the two, which is because this is the longest in terms of name. This is the longest name. So when it's long, it's a long name. So think about lungs. It's long, so it's in the lungs. And what the lungs do, of course, in terms of their function, when things get down in them, you have to get it out. So think about it. It's a long name, pseudo-stratified ciliated columnar epithelium. It's long. So you'd find these in the lungs and also lining the respiratory tract associated with the lungs. Good. Next one now. So we spoke about columnar. Now you have stratified columnar. So the stratified is more than one layer of these rectangular cells, and their function is protection. Do note that they're very rare. You don't really find them a lot. You'll find a lot of them. But when you do, they are located in the urethra, junction of the esophagus, and in the stomach itself. So this is showing the stratified columnar. So notice, if you look at the diagram first, they're columnar, right, in here, and here you have them all stacked up upon one another. So it's really rows. You have several rows of these stratified long cells, and there are several layers of them, and therefore their function is one of both protection and secretion. So let's see if we could just revisit those things. In terms of tissues, what do we have? Squamous, cuboidal, columnar, and pseudo-stratified. So those are the major ones, S, C, C, and S, the longer one, pseudo-stratified. What are their specialization? Well, the simple ones, diffusion. Just think about it, diffusion. The cubes, think about the brick, right? Outside with a sponge on it, absorb and secretion. The columnar, simple columnar. So both, when you think about outside, you know, bricks could be square, like a tile, or it could be like a column. So they both, when you're thinking about their specialization, they both do the same thing. They both absorb and secrete. The pseudo-stratified, yeah, go ahead.
So I'm going to remember the simple cuboidal and the simple columnar is that both SC have the same thing, sir?
Oh yes, true. Very good. Yeah. So S and C, when you write them out. So SC, very good. Thank you. Right? And SC. They both have SC, so therefore you know they do the same thing as it relates to their function. So simple cuboidal and simple columnar, absorb and secrete, absorb and secrete. We know the pseudo-stratified, that's a long one. Pseudo-stratified is long, so it's lungs. When we think about the lungs, we're thinking about the respiratory tract, things going down in the lungs, so it has to remove it. That's a removal of the debris. So the only one you really have to think about is the SS, the simple squamous. Right, those are the flattened ones. And when you remember the simple squamous, we mentioned it is flat like a Crick's biscuit. Well, a Crick's ain't really flat, but you get the idea. And therefore, when you think about it being flat and so thin, well, why is it so thin? Well, things could move through it very easily. So those movement is related to diffusion. And you think about their location, well, since diffusion is usually associated with the lungs, right? So that's how you get the alveoli. With absorption and secretion, the cuboidal is associated with the kidney, ovaries, and the glands, whereas the columnar, think about it, is there. These are longer ones. You get it in the tracts. So you have the digestive and the respiratory tract. You know, those are the long areas, and the uterus, right? So of course, that's where implantation occurs with the development of the fetus, and the pseudo-stratified, as you mentioned, that is in the respiratory tract. All right. So nice way to remember those things. Stratified now, when you're thinking about layering, stratified, all of them protection. The only difference is with the stratified columnar, the tall ones, they also secrete. And in terms of their location, well, you'd find them stratified squamous and the skin, mouth, esophagus, ducts, the cuboidal ones. They are found in the ducts of the mammary, sweat and salivary glands, and the columnar specifically, they're located in the urethra junction. These are the rare ones, junction of the esophagus and the stomach itself. Good. So this is just repeating just what we looked at, you know, the different types of cells and their functions. So we look at cells. Now let's move on to glands. So glands, what are they composed of? Well, glands are composed of epithelial tissue. And there are two types to remember, exocrine and endocrine. Now the exocrine, they secrete their products into a duct, whereas the endocrine secrete their products directly into the blood. Somebody want to explain that to me? What does this mean? This one, it goes into a duct. This one goes directly into the blood. What does that mean?
So if I could explain, the endocrine, if it's sent duct, it sends it into like, imagine a holding bay. And the endocrine, if it sends it straight into the blood, it's not storing it anywhere. It's just realize some function needs to be done, and okay, it just sends it out one time into your bloodstream.
Yeah. Very good, very good. So imagine then, like, you know, if you're living somewhere and it have some people living on the main road, and it have some people they ain't living on the main road. Yeah, you know, it have a little track to go, you pass by, go along the track, and then you come to the house. When you're thinking about exocrine, the exocrine, that duct is like the track. So the exocrine, they'll secrete something, but it had to pass along the little track, and come, and then it reached the main road. The main road, that is where the blood is flowing, right? So that is some blood vessel or some other structure that carries blood. So, but whereas the endocrine, they're right on the main road. So if that reach out on the road or go and flag a maxi, they just come down and they go one time onto the main road. They have nothing, they don't pass through anything, and it's not stored in any structure per se. But one time you come down your steps, boom, you reach the main road. And that's the difference between exocrine and endocrine. Endocrine, you have to take a little track to get to them, and those are the ducts, right? So a duct is really like a passageway. And then, so things, when the exocrine gland secretes it, it has to pass along a passageway before it gets into the blood. Whereas with the endocrine, it has no passageway, it's directly connected to the blood supply itself. So as your colleague quite rightly mentioned, once it's secreted, it goes directly into the blood. We good? So these are some examples. This is a question. Which of the following is a location where you would find simple cuboidal epithelium? Where would you find it? Anybody remembers?
Want to say the kidneys?
Location of simple cuboidal, and give me an explanation. How you figure it out? Go ahead.
All I remember is a protection, so it's like a wall. Oh,
right. So it is protection, fine in simple cuboidal, and quite rightly the answer is indeed in the kidney 3. So you're quite right there. Let's get back to now. So we mentioned gland. We already finished with the cell type, different types. Let's get into the specialized types now. So connective tissue. Connective tissue, these stabilize, bind, and support other tissues. So that is their function. And do take note of them, right? They stabilize, they bind, and they support. They're usually separated by extracellular materials, and the cells, the connective tissue cells, secrete this extracellular material themselves. And there are different types. There are 6 types, sorry. Areola, adipose, dense cartilage, bone, and blood. Could you think about a word we could use for all of these letters? AADCBB. Could you think of a word that has all of those letters? So, you know, it will help us to remember it.
So we could say ADA-CAB.
ADA-CAB.
Yeah.
AD, Ada Cab, ADACAB. B.
Yeah, like the name Ada.
Or
and
Ada.
with
Oh, I sorry,
Cab.
I did. Ada Cab.
Yeah, I guess I would use that one. I don't see any other way.
ADA.
Oh, Cab Dad. Or Dad Cab. Wait.
D,
No. Forget it. It's Ada Cab. Okay, I'll go with Ada Cab.
Ada Cab. ADA.
So what
Okay.
about bad cab?
Bad Cab.
Yeah.
BAD. C. Bad Cab. BADCAB. So you piggyback on what you were saying about cab. So she helped you. Your colleague helped you in terms of finding that out. But I find that's a good one. Bad cab, right? Or Ada Cab, whichever makes sense to you. All right. So you could use whichever one. Bad cab, BADCAB. That's a nice way when you think about connective tissue. Think about a bad cab, right? BADCAB. And what the B would stand for? Well, bone. A would stand for areolar tissue, right? D would be for dense, tendons and ligaments. C for cartilage, A for adipose, and then B again will be for blood. Interestingly, blood is considered a connective tissue. So let's talk about them. The areola, the A. These cells are known as fibroblasts, and their function is to bind and support. And where would you find them? On the skin, around organs, and between muscles. Right? So this is what they look like. Do take note, because questions could come, especially more so for the lab. You get in the lab, not for the lecture per se, where you could get, let's say, this image and ask, what is this? What cell type is this? All right, and in this case, what we're looking at is a fibroblast. The loose adipose. And what is another? When I hear adipose, what word comes to mind? 3-letter word. Adipose tissue.
Fat.
Fat, yeah. So adipose is synonymous with fat. That is very true. All right, so here it is, adipose tissue. They store triglycerides, and it's an energy storage. And of course, the location is under the skin around kidneys and the heart itself. So here is showing again the location. Loose adipose, you do find it in the stomach area. And of course, in the breast themselves. It's found around the skin, around kidneys and heart. So it's kind of like a packaging material. It's a nice way to view it. It's like packaging material, and they function in storage, insulation, and they cushion the organ, which is why you would find fat located around these organs. Anybody here has cut up chicken? Buy whole chicken. I know everybody these days is probably
Yes,
parts
sir.
and so on.
Yes,
But if interestingly, but usually sometimes the giblets are actually, or the organs, they're usually removed as well. They're not usually attached.
So if you buy it from like a wholesaler,
The farm.
so they will leave
The
what
organs
you
in.
want.
So right. What I was trying to get at is, go ahead.
The heart does have the fat in the chicken.
Yeah. So if you're looking at the parts, if you buy a liver and heart, when they sell it, and if you look at the heart itself, you'd see it has this layer of fat around it. So that's just an example of protection which it does. And of course, when you're going theater, ultimately in your training, you would see that the organs themselves always have this layer around it, this fatty layer. And the function of that is really one of protection.
So that fatty layer does look so gross.
Yeah.
It looks like,
it does.
like little balls.
Yes, it
So
does.
nasty.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. Really, you'll get used to it though. Okay, so the next one, connective tissue, dense connective. These attach bones to bone in case of ligaments, and muscle to bone in terms of tendons. So ligaments and tendons. How it is, do we remember that ligaments is bone to bone and muscle to bone is tendons? Anybody has a way to remember? Because it's very easy to mix them up. How do you remember it? Or do you just remember it offhand? And there's anybody?
Can you repeat? Didn't hear you properly.
Sure, not a problem. How do you remember that a ligament you know, is an attachment for bone to bone, and a tendon is muscle to bone, because it's very easy to mix them up. And you might say, well, a ligament is muscle to bone, which isn't true. So how do you, is there a way, a technique you have that you know bone to bone is ligament, or do you just learn it off straight, you know, rote memory, as it were?
So, so there is a way, sir.
Okay, okay, we
For
come
me,
back
sir,
to you, Camille. Somebody else wanted to jump in. Go ahead, Bina.
Sorry. For bone for me, I would say ligament because it's like leg kind of thing. Sort of.
Ooh, leg, I hear you. So when you think about leg, what comes to mind is bone, right? Because it definitely, structurally, your leg is the longest. It does contain the longest bone in the body, incidentally, your femur. That is quite true. So when you think about ligament, leg, bone, so bone to bone, I hear you. All right, that's a good one. Yes. So back to you, Camille. You think of one?
So if I say this correct, right? Tendons are soft, right, sir?
Yeah, well, yeah, once
Well, your muscles are just flesh, right? So those are soft too, right? So
Ah, I see what you're saying. Yes. So anything about tendons, right? A little fleshy. So therefore the tendon is muscle to bone, since it has that soft texture to it. I hear you. So muscle to bone, tendon. Good. So whichever way, we got two examples there. One from Camille, one from Bina. So whichever one you're comfortable with, you run with it. Excellent. So next we move on. We just looked at dense connective, and this is what they look like. So this is structurally. So looking at the dense connective here, showing you in the knee. So if it's connecting bone to bone here, what would this be? Would this be a ligament or a tendon if it's bone to bone?
Ligament.
Ligament, because leg. When you think about leg, yeah, very good. Right, so that's just showing you an example of dense connective tissue. Now, specialized. We look at dense connective ligaments and tendons. Now we have a specialized type, and the cells are known as chondrocytes, and they are located in chambers called lacunae. We don't have, for the purpose of this course, we don't have to get into any great detail, so I wouldn't spend a lot of time on this topic, except to say, remember this one, this diagram, or not a diagram, this is actually a microscopic view of what it looks like. All right, and this is hyaline cartilage, but we don't have to get into any great detail about this. We'll look at this more when we get into the lab. Bone cells, they do contain osteocytes. And what is one of the function of bone? Well, as we know, it's particularly hard. This specialized connective tissue, it facilitates movement, as we mentioned, along with muscles and the nervous system. Bone also stores lipids, calcium, and phosphorus. For those who cook, what do you use bones for? Anissa, go ahead.
So sorry, I'm late.
That's okay. It's not a problem. It's all right. Just jump in. Thanks for letting us know. Okay, so bone, specialized connective, right? What do we use bone for in the kitchen? Is there any?
For
yeah,
like broth and stuff?
There we go. Yes, right, for stock. Thank you very much, Bunny. We could, we know them too, right? So you can make stock and so on. And the reason why is because, well, not only because it has calcium and phosphorus, it has a lot of flavor associated with it as well. It have anybody here who is cracked chicken bone and chew it up and make a pile of dust on the plate? Okay, probably wouldn't want to raise your hand and acknowledge it.
Yes, sir.
I don't do it. My sister used to do that. Leave a bit, yum, yum, yum. And when it's done, there's a whole pile of things. But you could only do that with store-bought chicken. If you try to do that with common fowl, right, you wouldn't have any teeth left, because them common fowl, the bone is like, very, very hard. So yes, and again, one of the reasons why you chew on that is because in the marrow itself, it has a lot of flavor, and part of that flavor is because of the fat present there. For those of us who cook, we're well aware that fat means flavor when you're cooking. Is that true? Fat is flavor when you're cooking?
Yes.
Very true. Think about something that doesn't have any kind of fat in it. think about a bara or think about a bake, a roast bake. Which one is tastes better? Imagine if you're boiling doubles, how it would taste. Not as good, I assure you, right? So fat is flavor, and that is a general rule that you always learn in cooking, and which is why whenever you want flavor, you add oil, you add fat to it. Right? Think about pastries, yum, 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 flaky pastry. What makes it nice and flaky, right? It's the grease you put into it. You put cold margarine, and you keep folding. You put it in the fridge, and then you take it back out, put more, and fold. And then when you bake it, it melts. The fat melts the grease, and then it leaves those spaces, and that's how the pastry gets flaky. And the more butter you add, it's just really good. Okay, it's around lunchtime. Let's go forward, shall we? So, bone protects and supports internal. It supports movement. It stores, is a storage function, and it also produces blood cells, right? So you do have a specialized hematopoietic stem cells present in the bone marrow, and they produce red blood cells. So very important as well, the stem cells found within the bone marrow, they produce red blood cells. All right, so here it is, we're looking at bone. And one important fact, you looked at this in SNF1, the skeleton. So I wouldn't get into it. Well, you will look at it, sorry, in next couple of weeks. I wouldn't get into great detail about it. The epiphysis, diaphysis, and this again, the epiphysis, both of the epiphyses, these are the ends of the bone, and the diaphysis is really the shaft of the bone. But we get into greater detail when we look at the skeleton. This again is just showing connective tissue. And this here, this is a stain using iodine. It's an iodine stain. So we'll speak more about, you would look more at this when we are looking specifically at the skeleton. But this is just like a cross section of this bone here. What bone is this one here? I forget. I forgot what this is.
The humerus.
Thank you. Yes, the chuckle when I laughed there, it gave it away. Very good. So this one is the humerus, and this is the humerus in section. So they take out the humerus and they cut it in section, and this is what it looks like. The stain is iodine, and that's why it's black. It's blackened there and also all around. One of these things, this is probably the most recognizable image that it could give you in biology. I can't remember any other stain what they use iodine for, only for bone. So whenever you see you get a stain where it has this particular arrangement, where these circular arrangements around a black hole, you could close your eye and say, yeah, that's bone, because it's the only thing which I could remember that you use iodine for in biology as a stain. All right, bone. Let's talk about blood. Blood is a specialized connective tissue. It contains both red, white, and platelets. The main function of red blood cells is to do what? What's the main function of red blood cells?
Transporting
oxygen.
into the body.
Oxygen, anybody?
Right, yeah, carry oxygen, right, in the body. And so it goes to the level of the cell. What does the cell use the oxygen for? To break down what? Food, yeah, food. So either, well, one of the substances which you would have looked at previously is the one with sugar. I don't know if you remember that equation, where it's sugar plus oxygen gives you carbon dioxide, water, and energy. Where the sugar is represented, glucose C6H12O6 plus 6O2. Giving you 6CO2, 6H2O plus energy. I don't know if you remember that equation for respiration, yeah?
Yes,
It's
sir.
the respiration, right? And that's all basically, that's a major reason why we need oxygen to facilitate that process, which is why, by extension, if you don't have oxygen, what would happen? Energy starts
to deplete.
Yeah, so and you'll start to feel weak, right? And if left unchecked, all of the functions of your body will begin to shut down. Your organs will begin to shut down because they no longer have the energy to do anything. And then, of course, you'll be talking with the ancestors, right? That'll be the last stage. So very important, blood, the red cells. The white cells, very important for fighting infection. You will look at this in SNF2 during the second lecture, in SNF2, in terms of the functions of blood components. The platelets, really important to do what? Clotting. And there's a cascade of reaction involving proteins and different enzymes, right? Fibrinogen comes to mind in particular to form fibrin, which looks like a net. So you can think about it, if you're fishing with a net and the blood, so if you go by the sea, let's say the sea is the circulating blood and the fish in the sea is the red blood cell. You throw the net and what happens, you catch the fish. And as you pull in the net, the water drains off, but the fish remains in the net. And that is actually, those fish is representative of the red blood cells. And that's how they actually, it forms a clot. Right, so fibrin, which is a protein, it helps in that, and the cell fragments also assist in that process. You look at that more in SNF2. So this is an example here. What type of blood cells are these here? Anybody? What type of blood cell? Red cells or white cells?
Red, sir.
Red, yeah, because here you see the image of it, and not only that, you can tell by the shape of it. Not necessarily expected to know it by now, but you will get to it in SNF2. So they're biconcave discs and they have this circular appearance to them. And these here, what cells these are? These are the white blood cells. Quite right, yeah. So they look white blood. Correct. And usually when you have an infection, that's how, which is one of the reasons they take a blood sample or they do a blood test when you are ill. They could actually, just by looking at a blood sample, these white blood cells are elevated when you are ill because they come in to destroy any bacteria in particular. So that's how, when the white blood cell count is elevated, that's how they could tell you have an infection. And that could simply be done from a simple blood test, which is another reason when persons come in, they will perform a blood test as a means of analysis. Right, so this is just talking about the different blood types, connective tissue, which we looked at, the areolar adipose in terms of connective, and then the specialized one, the cartilage, bone, and blood. All right, which cells are found in dense connective tissue? We wouldn't address that, but let's get on to muscle tissue. We almost finished, so let's hold strain, all right? You all need a break?
No, sir.
Let's go.
No, sir.
Almost there. Let's talk about muscle. So muscle tissue. When an impulse, electrical impulse, is applied to a muscle, it can only do one thing. It contracts and gets shorter. When the impulse is removed, it goes back to its original length. And when we talk about this impulse, the impulse is provided via the nervous system. Now, when we look at muscle tissue, there are three types of muscle: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscle tissue. Skeletal, or some people say skeletal, where do you think they'll be attached to? By the very name.
The bones.
Yeah,
Bones.
that's what they do to the skeletal system. And could you raise your arm? If I tell you raise your right hand, could you do that?
Yes, sir.
Yes, you could. So therefore, it's under voluntary control, which would mean you could think about it and you could actually bring about that change. So important to note, skeletal muscle, voluntary control. So this is just an image showing what skeletal muscle looks like. If you notice, it has these squiggly lines, flattened nuclei. If you notice, the nuclei are indeed smaller. We'd speak more about this when we do the lab section on this. Right? So one of the characteristics of skeletal muscle is these lines, flattened nuclei, and it do have some areas that are very wide in terms of the muscle cell. Cardiac muscle. When you hear the word cardiac, what comes to mind? Which organ is usually associated?
Heart.
Heart. Yes, right? Now, what type of control? Could anybody here slow down their heart rate? Like, can you slow it down now?
No, sir.
Granted, some people might
No.
say if they do meditation and so on, yoga, what have you not, you could, slow it down. But that is more related to breathing, you control your breathing, you can control your heart rate. But generally speaking, is it under voluntary control? No, it's under
No.
involuntary.
Otherwise, a lot of
Why
us
do you
will be
think?
dead.
Yeah, why? True. Why do you think it's not under voluntary control? Would we have a problem if it was under voluntary control when we go to sleep?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
What would be the problem?
The heart would stop.
Yeah, because imagine you have to, you're thinking about it. Beat, 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 beat.
We'll be talking with the ancestors.
Thank you. There you go, Riser. Yeah. So you fall asleep and you're talking with your ancestors. That'll be the end of the show. So that is why your nervous system actually controls it in terms of involuntary control. And this is just showing some example of cardiac muscle, right? So this is example here. Now, sometimes cardiac muscle looks like normal muscle tissue, skeletal muscle, but the major difference is cardiac muscle has these lines here. You see them? It's a specialized line known as an intercalated disc. You see in these lines? Oops, sorry. You all see the lines?
Yes.
I'm running
Yes, sir.
the hand over them, these perpendicular lines. And they are known as intercalated discs. And that is the way, if you're given, let's say, three type of images of three type of tissue, smooth, cardiac, and skeletal, how you can tell the difference? Because sometimes cardiac looks a lot like skeletal, but how you can tell the difference between the two? If you notice the color, everything like a pink, then you have these dark pink perpendicular lines that's scattered around. And that's how you know, from the time you see these perpendicular darker lines, it's cardiac tissue. Smooth, right? Where would you find them? Around organs and structures in your digestive system. When we eat in, imagine you eat something for lunch. Nom, 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 nom. When you finish eating, how do things move through your digestive tract? Could you consciously move things after you finish eat it and you swallow it? Could you move it to your stomach and then to your small intestine, to your large intestine, and then could you do that? No, it's done automatically. So automatically means it's not under voluntary control. It's not something you could just do. It's involuntary control. Just like what else is under involuntary control in terms of muscle tissue that we looked at? Smooth, skeletal, or cardiac? Which one is under involuntary control?
Cardiac.
Cardiac, yeah. Involuntary means you have no control over it, right? Voluntary means you have control. And what is the one type of muscle tissue that you have voluntary control over?
Muscular.
Muscle tissue.
Yeah, which type? Which type? So you have three. You have skeletal, smooth, and cardiac. Which one you could voluntarily control?
Skeletal.
Skeletal. Very good. Very good. Very good. All right. So this is just showing smooth muscle here. So you find this in the gut digestive tract, and that helps with moving the food along. Now notice with these smooth muscle, they're long, right? They have a long structure, and the nucleus as well is long, and they're closely packed together. Right, and this just tells you about the three in terms of where you find them and the functions that they do. Which one is under voluntary control again? I forget. Which one?
The skeletal.
Skeletal, very good. And this is the last, we have a couple slides, about 5 slides again, the nervous tissue. And nervous tissue, all I have to say is we'll speak more in detail of this in the next, actually next thing we're going to look at in terms of in a day or two, the nervous system. But these nervous tissue, very important, they form the nervous system, and together with the with the skeletal and the muscle tissue, they're responsible for movement. This is a typical neuron or nerve cell. And what does it look like? Well, you notice it has a nucleus. This is the neuron, this is cytoplasm. The cytoplasm of a nerve cell is known as the cell body. So that is the cell, and within here you have mitochondria and different organelles. This is a support cells neuroglia. And this is the axon. So one of the recognizable structures when you look at a neuron is this extension of the membrane known as an axon. And what this extension does, it allows for the passage, and we look at this when we look at nerves, of action potentials to pass down it, down its length. And action potential is nothing more than a charge. And how is this charge passed along? Rather fascinating. Sodium, you have a concentration of sodium gates here, they open, and sodium is actually passing along. And that is all it is. Sodium, in terms of the charge associated with sodium, it has a positive charge. So as it passes along, this positive charge is carried along. And that's the main thing with neurons. Why salt is so important for the proper functioning of the nervous system, because sodium and the positive charge is critical to its function. And that is where we will end today's lecture. Okay, so let me just stop the recording.
Excuse me.
1 second.
I have a question.